In the middle of World War II, a Japanese soldier dug into a defensive position on a Pacific island, watching the tree line for enemy armor. In front of him sat a weapon that looked strange even by the standards of the time. Too big to call a rifle, too light to call a cannon. It weighed over 50 kilograms and needed a whole crew to operate. And it fired 20mm armor-piercing shells. This was the Type 97 anti-tank rifle, a Japanese weapon built in the late 1930s for a new kind of mechanized warfare. The Japanese military wanted something ordinary infantry could use to fight tanks on their own, a weapon light enough to bring to the front line, a weapon that gave a single soldier a fighting chance against armor without waiting for artillery support. And when it first appeared, the Type 97 genuinely looked like a breakthrough. But there was a problem. The world was changing faster than the weapon could. Tanks got heavier, armor got thicker, and a gun built to beat yesterday's tanks suddenly found itself facing tomorrow's war. This isn't just the story of one anti-tank rifle. It's a story about engineering ambition, about the limits of Japanese industry, and about how even brilliant, unusual technology can lose its meaning when war moves faster than it does. By the 1930s, armies around the world were preparing for a different kind of war. World War I had already shown that the battlefield no longer belonged to infantry alone. Tanks had changed what offense and defense even meant. Machine guns, barbed wire, and artillery used to be enough to plan around. Now there was a new threat: armored vehicles that could punch straight through a defensive line. By the mid-1930s, the major powers were racing to build up their tank forces. Germany was fielding new armored vehicles. The Soviet Union was churning out huge numbers of light and medium tanks. Britain and France were experimenting with different ways to use armor on the battlefield. Japan understood just as well that tanks were the future of warfare. But Japan had a problem the others didn't share to the same degree. It simply didn't have the industrial base of the US or the Soviet Union. It couldn't mass produce heavy anti-tank guns and hand them out to every infantry unit. So Japanese planners looked for a different answer, something infantry could carry and use on its own at ground level. In the early 1930s, most armies were still relying on oversized anti-tank rifles for this job. The logic was simple: build something one or two soldiers could carry and fire at an enemy tank. But standard rifle ammunition hit its limits fast. Even light tanks were getting thicker armor, and a normal rifle round just couldn't do the job anymore. Japanese engineers decided to go a different direction. Instead of just scaling up a rifle, they built something closer to a miniature automatic cannon. Development of the Type 97 began in the mid-1930s, led by Nippon Special Steel. The brief was brutal: build something powerful enough to punch through armor, but still light enough for infantry to operate. The answer was a 20mm shell. The Type 97 fired 20 by 124mm rounds, a far bigger round than any standard infantry rifle used. A shell that size could carry a lot more energy and use a proper armor-piercing design. For the late 1930s, that was a real advantage. Japan officially adopted the weapon in 1937. Its name comes from the Japanese imperial calendar. 1937 corresponded to the year 2597, which is where Type 97 comes from. To Japanese military planners, it looked like a modern answer to the tank problem. On paper, it was a great pitch. Even a small infantry unit could now fight tanks without waiting for artillery. But the first field tests made one thing clear: That kind of firepower came at a cost. What made the Type 97 stand out wasn't just its caliber, it was how it worked. This wasn't a scaled-up bolt-action rifle. It had a fully automatic reloading system. Part of the energy from each shot cycled the mechanism, letting the gun fire multiple rounds without the shooter reloading by hand. For an anti-tank weapon of that era, that was a real edge. Most comparable systems needed the shooter to manually reload after every shot. The Type 97 could put rounds on target faster. But automation cut both ways. A more complex mechanism meant more maintenance, and that's a real liability in the middle of an actual war. The gun needed regular cleaning and careful upkeep to keep functioning. There was also the recoil problem. A shell that powerful put enormous stress on the whole design, and someone had to actually stand behind it and pull the trigger. To handle that, engineers gave the Type 97 an elaborate recoil reduction system. The barrel and part of the mechanism slid backward on firing to absorb energy, paired with a muzzle brake. It borrowed heavily from artillery engineering. Japanese designers were essentially trying to shrink autocannon technology down to infantry scale. That solution came with a price tag though. The Type 97 ended up weighing around 50 kilograms unloaded. Compare that to roughly 4 kilograms for a standard infantry rifle of the era. A soldier couldn't just sling it over his shoulder and move across the battlefield. It needed a crew, one man to fire, others to help carry the gun, haul ammunition, and set up the firing position. Complicated as it was, the Type 97 was genuinely one of the most unusual anti-tank weapons of its time. But it's worth being precise about what it was built for. Not every tank that would ever exist, but the specific threat that existed in the mid-1930s: light and medium armor. That's exactly where its greatest strength and its greatest weakness both came from. Japanese planners had designed it around the reality of their moment. The war that actually arrived a few years later played by different rules entirely. In the late 1930s, most light tanks really did have thin armor. They were built mainly for infantry support, reconnaissance, and fast-moving operations. And against exactly that kind of target, a heavy anti-tank rifle could do real damage. A 20mm armor-piercing round carried enough energy to defeat that armor at close range, giving Japanese infantry a genuine way to fight back against tanks on their own. But the Type 97 was never a light weapon in any sense. Its size and weight limited how it could be used. A crew had to pick a position in advance, set the gun up, prepare ammunition, and arrange cover. Unlike a standard rifle a soldier could use in almost any situation, the Type 97 needed planning. This was fundamentally an ambush weapon. It had to wait for the tank to come to it. It couldn't advance alongside attacking infantry. Ammunition brought its own headaches. 20mm shells were far heavier than standard rounds, which meant crews could carry a smaller supply into a fight. In a drawn-out battle, that became a real problem. Every extra shell meant more weight to haul, and an anti-tank weapon that runs out of ammunition loses its value fast. Despite all that, the Type 97 was an important weapon for the Japanese army in the early years of the war. As Japan expanded operations across Asia and the Pacific, the gun ended up in the hands of many infantry units, and it was especially effective against light armor. Early in the war, the vehicles Allied forces were fielding often fell right within what the Type 97 could handle. One of the first real tests came in China. From 1937 onward, Japan fought a large-scale campaign against Chinese forces, whose armored units were limited and mostly light-class tanks. Against that kind of opposition, the Type 97 did exactly what it was designed to do. But China was only the beginning. The real test for the Japanese army came once the war expanded into the Pacific. In December 1941, Japan launched a massive offensive against the United States and its allies, rapidly seizing huge stretches of territory. During this period, the Type 97 saw action against British, American, and Allied armor. During the Malayan campaign, Japanese forces ran into British armored units, but combat conditions there looked nothing like the European front. Jungle terrain, poor roads, and difficult ground limited how tanks could even be used. In that kind of environment, even a modest anti-tank weapon could be dangerous. The Type 97 let Japanese infantry engage armor at close range. In the Philippines, Japanese forces faced American armor, including the M3 Stuart light tank, still a viable target for the Type 97. Used correctly, Japanese crews could damage it. But the core problem was already showing itself. To get results, the crew had to be very close to the tank, and that made them extremely exposed. A tank was never just an armored shell. It was a whole system: crew, machine guns, communications, supporting infantry. Even if the Type 97 could punch through the armor, the act of attacking it was dangerous in itself. The crew had to wait for the right moment, land a precise shot, and somehow avoid return fire. That problem only got worse as the war went on. Light tanks were everywhere at the start of World War II, but within a few years, everything had shifted. Tanks got bigger, engines got more powerful, armor got thicker. Entirely new classes of armored vehicles appeared. For Japan, the real turning point was the American M4 Sherman medium tank. The Sherman had far more serious protection than the light tanks of the war's early years. And against it, the Type 97 was no longer the weapon it had been designed to be. It could still do damage in the right circumstances, but its overall effectiveness had dropped sharply. This was the moment the truth became obvious. The Type 97 wasn't a bad weapon. It just belonged to a different era. Its designers had solved a 1930s problem. The war of the 1940s was asking an entirely different question. Armies no longer just needed something that could punch through thin armor. They needed systems that could keep pace with armor that kept getting heavier. Japan tried to adapt. New anti-tank weapons were developed. Artillery got more powerful. New types of ammunition appeared. But the core problem never went away. Japanese industry simply couldn't turn out new systems fast enough. So the old weapons stayed in service long after their capabilities had been outpaced. By 1944, the Type 97 was mostly a defensive tool. It wasn't hunting tanks in the open anymore. It was fired from bunkers, fortifications, and prepared positions. It had become a last resort weapon against enemy armor. By the end of the war, the Type 97 had become a symbol of one of the Japanese military's deepest problems: the widening gap between weapons development and the actual demands of modern combat. A gun that looked cutting edge in 1937 could no longer do its original job by the mid-1940s. To understand why, it helps to look at how other countries solved the same problem. By the late 1930s, most militaries had reached the same conclusion. infantry needed its own way to fight tanks, but each country took a different path. Britain built the Boy's anti-tank rifle, a heavy .55 caliber rifle, considerably lighter than the Type 97 and operable by a single soldier. But its capability also fell off fast as tank armor got thicker. Germany built the Panzerbüchse 39, chambered for a dedicated 7.92 by 94mm anti-tank round. It was lighter than the Japanese weapon, but like the Boy's rifle, it was really only built to handle early war tanks. As armor grew, these rifles lost relevance across the board. The Soviet Union went a different way entirely. In 1941, it introduced the 14.5mm PTRD and PTRS anti-tank rifles, simpler to build, cheaper to produce, and manufactured in huge numbers. The real advantage of the Soviet approach was sheer volume. Thousands of these rifles reached the front, and even if any single weapon had limitations, having that many on the battlefield created a serious threat to enemy armor on its own. And that's exactly where Japan's approach diverged. The Type 97 was technically sophisticated. Automatic fire, an elaborate recoil reduction system, a powerful 20mm round. But sophistication meant higher cost and slower production. And in a war of this scale, that turned out to be the deciding factor. World War II made one thing clear. Victory doesn't just depend on how good any single weapon is. It depends on how many effective weapons a country can actually build. The US could turn out thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces. The Soviet Union kept producing enormous quantities of equipment even under brutal wartime conditions. Germany built technically impressive machines but constantly struggled with production. Japan ended up in the same bind. Its engineers designed genuinely interesting weapons, but the industrial base behind them simply wasn't there. Still, it would be wrong to call the Type 97 a failed design. For its era, it was a genuine achievement. Building an automatic weapon at that caliber was a serious engineering challenge, and Japanese designers actually solved the recoil problem. They built a system that could handle a powerful shell without destroying the person firing it. The real issue with the Type 97 was never the engineering. It was that the entire concept of the anti-tank rifle was becoming obsolete. Early in the war, that kind of weapon made complete sense. But as tanks kept evolving, armies started moving on to other solutions: heavier anti-tank guns, rocket-propelled anti-tank weapons, and shaped charge ammunition that could defeat armor almost regardless of thickness. By 1945, the Type 97's role had completely changed. It was no longer a symbol of modern Japanese military technology. It had become a defensive tool, used simply because there was often nothing better available. Japanese units kept using whatever they had against advancing Allied forces, but against well-armored American tanks, it wasn't doing much. The final years of the war were especially brutal. The Japanese army was increasingly pushed onto the defensive, and Pacific Islands turned into fortified positions that had to be defended piece by piece. In that kind of fight, even an outdated weapon still mattered, not because it could turn the tide of the war, but because it was one of the few tools of resistance left. After Japan's surrender in 1945, the Type 97 stopped being part of any active military. Japan's armed forces were dissolved, and most of their equipment was destroyed, captured, or put into storage. A handful of Type 97 rifles survive today in museums and private collections, rare reminders of Japanese military engineering at the end of the 1930s. The interest in the Type 97 today isn't because it was the most successful weapon of the war. Quite the opposite. Its story is compelling precisely because of the contradiction at its core. It was a complex, unusual, and technically ambitious project that happened to be built right as the entire concept it was based on was becoming outdated. The story of the Type 97 illustrates one of the fundamental truths of weapons development. A technological edge only lasts as long as it matches the conditions of the war being fought. A weapon can be powerful, it can be innovative, it can outperform everything that came before it. But once the enemy changes the rules of the game, none of that matters anymore. The Type 97 was born in an era when light tanks were the main threat facing infantry. It gave a soldier a real shot at stopping armor, and under the right conditions, it could actually do it. But the war didn't stand still in 1937. Within a few years, tanks had become something else entirely, and a weapon built to beat the last generation of armor found itself facing a future it was never designed for. Today, the Type 97 anti-tank rifle remains one of the strangest weapons to come out of Japan during World War II. It's a reminder that the history of weapons isn't only written by the winners. It's a history of decisions made by people at a specific moment in time with the tools they had. The people who built the Type 97 were trying to solve a real problem. They built something genuinely complex. They used every piece of technology available to them. But they couldn't stop the war itself from evolving. The Type 97 never changed the course of World War II. It didn't stop the Allied advance. It couldn't keep pace with the next generation of tanks. But it remains, at the same time, a testament to real engineering ambition and a lesson in just how fast a battlefield can change. This was a weapon built for a war of light tanks. It ended up facing a war of heavy armor. It was a weapon of the future in 1937 and a weapon of the past by the mid-1940s. And that's really the whole story of the Type 97 anti-tank rifle. Not a story of failure, just a story of a weapon that ended up on the wrong side of time.